Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time we're tackling Eric Ries's The Lean Startup.
You know, the book that's basically required reading for anyone building new products or starting a new business. We're not going to cover the whole thing, though.
Oh, of course not.
We're just focusing on the parts that are the most useful and actionable.
Like a cheat sheet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like your cheat sheet to building a company that can adapt and pivot when it needs to.
Which is pretty much all the time in the startup world, right?
Right. And we'll even get into how companies like Toyota achieve both speed and quality at the same time.
Which seems impossible.
I know.
But they do it. And Ries explains how they do it. What's interesting is that he actually takes those principles from lean manufacturing, the kind of system Toyota uses, and he applies them to startups.
So it's about taking that focus on efficiency
Exactly.
and applying it to a world that is anything but predictable.
Exactly.
And one of the most counterintuitive ideas he presents is the power of small batches.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're always told to think bigger, scale faster.
Right. But Ries is saying that's not always the best way.
Not always. He actually uses a really simple analogy. Stuffing envelopes.
Okay.
He says that doing it one at a time, instead of in huge batches, actually ends up being faster and more efficient in the long run.
It's like that old saying, slow and steady wins the race.
Exactly.
But how does that actually translate to building a product or starting a business?
Well, think of it this way. A startup's biggest challenge is figuring out what works, what resonates with their target market.
Yeah.
Small batches help you do that much faster. You're constantly testing and refining, identifying problems early on.
So it's like, instead of trying to create the perfect finished product right out of the gate, you're validating your assumptions every step of the way.
Exactly. It's like building a puzzle, but getting feedback on each piece as you fit it in, rather than waiting until the very end to see the whole picture.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a much more iterative approach.
It is.
So you're saying it's more about quickly validating those assumptions than spending months or even years trying to build something perfect before you even know if anyone wants it.
Exactly.
That's pretty different from how most companies operate.
It is, but it's much more effective, especially in the fast-paced world of startups. Reese's gives this great example of SGW Design Works.
Okay.
They build complex X-ray systems.
That sounds complicated.
It is. You'd think that would take months or even years to develop, right?
Yeah. That's not something you just whip up in an afternoon.
Right. But instead of getting stuck in endless planning, they used rapid prototyping and 3D modeling to test their ideas.
I see.
They were able to get feedback from their clients almost immediately and went through multiple design iterations in just a few days.
Wow. So they basically compressed months of work into days by using this small batch approach.
Exactly.
And it allowed them to validate their assumptions at every step of the process.
Exactly.
So what was the outcome?
They ended up going from concept to delivering the first production run of their X-ray system in just 3.5 weeks.
3.5 weeks. That's incredible.
It is. It's amazing what you can achieve when you break things down into smaller chunks and prioritize rapid learning.
It's almost like they created this feedback loop built on speed and efficiency.
Yeah, they did.
But what about those companies that are maybe a little further along? They've already got a product, but they're not sure how to get it in front of the right people.
That's where another key principle from the lean startup comes in. Pull, don't push.
Pull up, don't click.
Yeah. It's based on the idea of just-in-time production. But for startups, it's less about physical inventory and more about validating those core hypotheses.
So instead of pushing a product onto the market and hoping it takes off, you're saying it's more about designing experiments that answer critical questions about your target market.
Precisely. You want to create a pull where customers are actually asking for your product because they see the value in it. One company that really exemplifies this is Alphabet Energy.
Okay.
They were developing a low-cost geothermal power plant.
Geothermal. That's pretty cool.
It is. It's another example of a complex product.
For sure.
But they didn't try to build the perfect power plant in isolation.
What did they do?
They constantly interacted with potential customers, tested small-scale prototypes in the field, and iterated based on the feedback they received.
So they basically created this pull by focusing on what their customers actually wanted and needed instead of what they thought the market wanted.
Exactly.
That's a crucial distinction.
It is.
It's not about letting customers dictate product features, but it is about using those interactions to guide your development process.
Exactly.
So to recap, we've got small batches for fast learning and pull, don't push for staying aligned with your market.
Right.
It seems like these principles work together to create a really powerful engine for growth.
They do. But even with a powerful engine, you need a clear roadmap.
Okay.
And that's where Reese's concept of the three engines of growth comes in.
Okay. I'm ready to hear about these engines. Give me the rundown.
All right. So Rees argues that startups often get lost in a sea of potential improvements, unsure where to focus their energy.
I can see how that would happen.
Yeah, it's easy to get overwhelmed. But he says there are three primary ways to achieve growth:
Okay.
sticky, viral, and paid.
Hi.
And each has its own unique characteristics.
So it's like choosing the right tool for the job, depending on your product and your market.
Exactly.
Tell me more about each of these engines.
All right, so the first is the sticky engine.
Sticky engine?
Yeah, this is all about attracting and retaining customers for the long term.
So it's about building that loyal customer base.
Exactly. Think
Yeah.
subscription services, online communities, anything that keeps people coming back for more.
Okay. Makes sense. What about the viral engine? That sounds pretty exciting.
The viral engine is when your product spreads rapidly, almost like a virus.
I like it.
Think social media platforms or messaging apps, anything that encourages users to share it with their networks.
So word of mouth marketing on steroids, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
The key here is creating a product that people naturally want to talk about and recommend to others.
Okay. And what about the last engine, the paid engine?
The paid engine is pretty straightforward. It's about acquiring customers through paid advertising or other marketing channels.
So you're talking about things like e-commerce companies or SaaS products.
Right. Anything where you're spending money up front to attract new customers.
I see. So the key here is having a solid understanding of your customer acquisition cost and making sure you're generating enough revenue to offset that spending.
You got it. Now, the important thing here is to identify which engine is right for your business and align your metrics accordingly.
Because you wouldn't measure a viral product the same way you would measure a sticky product.
Exactly.
They're driven by different factors.
Right.
One is all about rapid user growth, and the other is about customer retention.
Exactly. And Venny's highlights a great example of a company that successfully pivoted by switching engines.
Okay.
Wealthfront.
Wealthfront.
Yeah. They started as an online investing game, trying to attract as many users as possible.
So they were using that viral engine.
Right. But later they pivoted to a platform, connecting investors with professional managers.
Interesting. So they moved from a viral engine to a sticky engine, focusing on building long-term relationships with clients instead of just chasing user growth.
Exactly.
And this pivot was driven by the insights they gained from their initial experiments, right?
Absolutely. They realized the real value they were offering wasn't the game itself, but the connections and financial advice they were providing.
So they pivoted to focus on their core value proposition.
They did.
And that shift in focus led to a much more sustainable and successful business model.
It did.
It's amazing how much you can learn from just paying attention to what's working
It is.
and being willing to adjust your course.
That's what the lean startup is all about.
This all really underscores the importance of that build, measure, learn loop we talked about earlier. You experiment, you gather data, and then you adapt based on what you've learned. But what about the organization itself? How do you actually build a company that can handle all this experimentation and change?
That's a great question. And it brings us to the final key takeaway from this section. Building an adaptive organization.
Building an adaptive organization.
Yeah, it's about creating a culture that embraces continuous learning and improvement.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, think of it this way. You want to build a company where processes evolve naturally in response to challenges, not one that gets bogged down in rigid structures.
So it's about being flexible and responsive, rather than sticking to a plan that might no longer be relevant.
Exactly.
I like that. So what's a good way to start building this kind of adaptability?
Rees recommends a really simple but powerful tool called the 5 whys technique.
The 5 whys.
Yeah. Basically, whenever you encounter a problem, you ask why 5 times.
5 times?
Yeah. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion to get to the root cause.
That sounds deceptively simple, but I can imagine it can lead to some pretty surprising insights.
It absolutely can. And it helps you shift from just putting out fires to actually preventing them from happening in the first place.
I like that. So it's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly.
We'll have to dig into that a little bit more when we come back. But for now, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in a few minutes to continue our deep dive into the lean startup. Okay, so we're back, and we were just talking about this really interesting concept from the lean startup called the 5 whys. It's about asking why 5 times to uncover the root cause of a problem. It sounds pretty simple, but I imagine it can be tricky to actually put this into practice.
You're right, it is. It actually takes a bit of a mindset shift. It's about moving from a blame culture, where everyone's afraid to admit mistakes, to a learning culture where those mistakes become valuable opportunities for improvement.
So if people are worried about getting in trouble, they're not going to be honest about what's really going on, right? They'll just try to cover things up and the problem will keep happening.
Exactly. The goal isn't to find a scapegoat. It's to identify those systemic issues that might be hiding beneath the surface. And to do that, you need to create an environment where people feel safe speaking up.
So how do you actually create that kind of environment where people feel comfortable being honest about problems and working together to solve them?
Well, RISE suggests starting small. Pick a specific area of your business where the 5 whys could be really helpful. Don't try to overhaul the entire company culture overnight.
Right.
It's too much. Just focus on something manageable,
Like what?
like customer complaints about billing errors,
Okay.
or delays in shipping, or recurring bugs in a particular software feature. Something specific and measurable.
So you're saying it's better to choose a smaller battle to fight,
Mm.
prove that the 5 whys works, and then expand from there.
Precisely. And once you've identified your target area, every time an issue pops up, you trigger the 5 whys process.
Okay.
Gather the relevant people, the ones who are closest to the problem, ask why 5 times, and document those responses.
Ray's also mentions having a designated 5 whys master. What exactly is their role in all this?
The 5 whys master acts as a facilitator.
Yeah.
They keep the process on track, make sure everyone has a chance to contribute, and most importantly, they make sure those insights are actually acted upon.
So it's not just about having a brainstorming session and then forgetting about it.
Nope.
It's about turning those discoveries into concrete actions that actually improve the way you work.
Exactly. And over time, as you keep using the 5 whys and addressing those root causes,
Yeah.
you start to see a real shift. You're not just putting out fires, you're preventing them from happening in the first place.
It becomes almost like a preventative maintenance system for your business.
It does.
And Rees actually gives an example of how this worked at IGN Entertainment,
Right. Yeah.
the huge online gaming media company.
Yeah.
They were already successful,
They were.
but they wanted to become even more agile and innovative.
It's a great example because it shows that these principles aren't just for struggling startups.
Right.
They can be beneficial for companies of all sizes.
So what did they learn from using the 5 whys?
One of the key benefits they discovered was that it helped them break down silos and improve communication between departments. Because often the root cause of a problem isn't limited to one team or one individual.
It's a systemic issue
It is.
that requires a more holistic solution.
Yeah.
And the 5 whys gives you a framework for having those conversations and making those connections.
Exactly. And it helps to shift the focus from individual blame to shared responsibility, which is crucial for creating a culture of continuous improvement.
You know, I think a lot of people assume that as companies get bigger, they inevitably become more bureaucratic and slow-moving.
Right.
But Rees seems to argue that it doesn't have to be that way.
He does. And the 5 whys is just one tool in the lean startup toolbox. But it's a really powerful one because it addresses a core challenge that many organizations face: the tendency to focus on symptoms instead of causes.
It's like that old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. The 5 whys is about teaching your organization to fish, to solve problems at their root.
I love that analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And it highlights the long-term benefits of building an adaptive organization.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about being quick to react. It's about developing the ability to anticipate and prevent problems before they even arise.
And that's really what sets successful companies apart in the long run. Speaking of being quick to react, one of the things that really stood out to me about the lean startup was this emphasis on pivoting.
Oh, yeah.
It's not something that's really talked about much in traditional business circles. In fact, it's often seen as a sign of failure.
It's true. Pivoting can feel like admitting you were wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But Rees completely reframes that idea. He says that pivoting is an essential part of the startup journey. It's about recognizing when your initial assumptions are wrong and having the courage to change course.
And he doesn't just say pivot and leave it at that. He provides this whole catalog of different types of pivots, from zoom-in pivots to customer segment pivots to platform pivots. It's like he's created a roadmap for navigating those moments of uncertainty.
Exactly. And each type of pivot is about testing a new hypothesis,
Okay.
gathering more data, and getting closer to that perfect product market fit.
And he also makes it clear that pivoting isn't just a one-time thing. Companies need to be willing to pivot throughout their life cycle, even after they've achieved some initial success.
Right, because the market is always changing. Customer needs evolve.
Yeah.
And what worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. If you're not willing to adapt, you're going to get left behind.
Reese's uses this great analogy of a startup's runway. It's not just about how much cash you have in the bank.
Right.
It's also about how many pivots you have left. How many times can you change course before you run out of resources?
That's such a powerful way to think about it. It really highlights the importance of using those lean principles to extend your runway.
Hmm.
By reducing waste, iterating quickly, and being decisive about those pivots, you give yourself more chances to succeed.
He also talks about the fear of failure, especially for startups that are in the public eye. There's so much pressure to maintain this perfect image and pretend like everything's going according to
Oh,
plan.
yeah. It's like everyone's watching. There's this perception that admitting mistakes makes you look weak. But Rees argues that this fear of failure can actually be detrimental to the learning process.
Because if you're not willing to admit when you're wrong, you're never going to get to those critical pivots that could lead to breakthrough success.
Exactly. It takes humility to acknowledge your mistakes and courage to change course when needed. And Rees actually uses Path, the social networking company, as an example of a startup that really embraced this idea.
Oh, right. Their initial product launch received some pretty harsh criticism from the tech press. It would have been easy for them to get defensive or try to silence those critics.
They could have just doubled down on their initial vision and ignored the feedback. But instead, they chose to listen, to learn from those criticisms,
Yeah.
and to iterate on their product based on what they learned.
So their response to that criticism was actually a pivot in itself.
It was.
They were pivoting their approach to feedback. And ultimately, that openness to feedback helped them find a path to success.
It did.
It's a great reminder that sometimes those harsh criticisms can actually contain valuable insights. It's all about how you choose to receive them.
It's about having that growth mindset, being open to new information, and recognizing that you don't have all the answers.
So if a company decides it needs to pivot, how do they actually go about making those decisions? It seems like it would be a pretty emotionally charged process, especially if you've invested a lot of time and energy into a particular direction.
It definitely can be tough. That's why Rise recommends having regular pivot or persevere meetings.
Pivot or persevere.
Yeah. Bring together the key stakeholders, review the data, have those tough conversations, and make a decision based on the evidence.
I like that. So it's a structured way to make sure you're making decisions based on evidence, not just emotions. He uses the example of Wealthfront again, which started as an online investing game, but pivoted to a platform that connects investors with professional managers. And that wasn't just a random decision, right? It came out of those pivot or persevere meetings.
Exactly. They had the data to show that their initial assumptions about the market were wrong. But those meetings also helped them uncover valuable insights that led them to a more successful path.
So it sounds like it's about finding that balance between being decisive and being data-driven. You need the discipline to gather the information, the honesty to acknowledge when you're wrong, and the courage to make those tough decisions.
You got it. And that brings us back to one of the core themes we've been exploring: the importance of choosing the right engine of growth. Because even if you're great at pivoting, if you're focused on the wrong engine, you're never going to reach your full potential.
Right, you can't just be everything to everyone. You have to focus on the engine that's most aligned with your product and your market. And that's something that a lot of startups struggle with.
They do. They get so caught up in the excitement of building something new that they forget to step back and ask those fundamental questions. How are we going to grow? What's our engine? And are we measuring the right things?
So let's do a quick recap of those engines. We have the sticky engine, which is all about customer retention.
Right. Think subscription services, online communities, loyalty programs, anything that keeps those customers coming back for more.
And the key metric there is the churn rate. How many customers are you losing each month? You want to keep that number as low as possible.
Exactly. Then we have the viral engine, which is all about rapid user growth through word of mouth and network effects.
Think social media platforms, messaging apps, online games, anything that spreads quickly and organically.
Right. And the key metric here is the viral coefficient. How many new users does each existing user bring in? You want that number to be as high as possible to create those exponential growth loops.
And finally, we have the paid engine, which is all about acquiring customers through paid advertising or other marketing channels.
Think e-commerce companies, SaaS products, online courses, anything where you're spending money upfront to attract new customers.
And the key metric here is the cost per acquisition. How much does it cost you to acquire each new customer? You want to keep that number as low as possible while still reaching your target audience.
You got it. Now, Rees makes a really important point about these engines. While companies can technically use multiple engines, it's usually more effective to focus on just one.
It goes back to that idea of focus and prioritization. Pick the engine that's most aligned with your business and go all in on making it work. But how do you know which engine is the right one?
That's where those early experiments and that build, measure, learn loop come into play. You test different approaches.
Yeah.
You gather data, and you see which engine starts to gain traction.
And once you've identified your engine, you can use those specific metrics we talked about to track your progress towards product market fit.
Exactly. And it's not just about hitting some magic number. It's about seeing consistent improvement over time.
Yeah.
Are your churn rates going down? Is your viral coefficient going up? Is your cost per acquisition decreasing? These are the questions you need to be asking yourself.
Reese uses this example of two hypothetical startups, both using the sticky engine.
Okay.
One has a higher growth rate, but the other is showing more consistent progress in improving its churn rate and customer lifetime value.
And he argues that the second startup is actually in a better position, even though its growth might be slower in the short term.
Because it's building a more sustainable business, one that's less reliant on external factors like marketing spend or hype. It's about building something that has real staying power. But what happens when those engines run out of gas? Because even the most successful companies can hit a plateau at some point.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something that Rees explores in the next chapter. He talks about the importance of managing a portfolio of activities and constantly looking for those new avenues for growth.
Sounds like we've got a lot more to unpack. I'm already starting to rethink my entire approach to building products and services. This is definitely some powerful stuff.
It is, and we're just scratching the surface here. But hopefully these insights will give you a good foundation for exploring these concepts in more depth.
So we've talked about picking the right engine of growth, but what happens when that engine starts to sputter? You hit a plateau, growth slows down. What do you do then? Do you just scrap everything and start over?
Not necessarily. It's definitely a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Instead of just optimizing your existing product or service, you start exploring entirely new avenues for growth.
So it's almost like becoming a startup within a startup?
Yeah, exactly.
You're taking everything you've learned and applying it to this new phase of growth.
Exactly. And Rees actually talks about this in the last chapter. He emphasizes the importance of managing a portfolio of activities.
Okay.
You're not just focusing on tuning your current engine, you're also developing new engines for the future.
So if one engine starts to lose steam, you've got others ready to take its place. And this applies to all kinds of companies, not just those in the startup phase. Right?
Absolutely. Whether you're a small startup or a huge corporation, this idea of constantly exploring new possibilities is crucial for long-term success. Rees uses a great example to illustrate this point.
Okay.
IMVU.
IMVU.
Yeah, they were a successful company, revenue was growing, but they started to see diminishing returns on their efforts.
Interesting. What do you think was happening? Did they need to make like a big pivot?
They did. They had fallen into a classic trap. By focusing so much on their early adopters, they had neglected the needs of the mainstream market. They needed to make a customer segment pivot and rethink their entire approach to attract new customers.
That sounds like a massive undertaking, especially when you're already doing well. Did that have to completely start from scratch?
Not exactly. They were able to apply the same lean startup principles they had used in the past. They built in small batches, got feedback early and often, and created a sandbox for experimentation.
So even though they were a successful company, they didn't let that success make them complacent. They were still willing to experiment and make bold changes to reach those new customers.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how companies can stay agile even as they grow.
They don't get stuck in that mindset of this is how we've always done it,
Right.
but instead embrace a culture of continuous learning and adaptation. I'm starting to see a common thread here. Whether you're talking about small batches, pivoting, or building an adaptive organization, it's all about embracing change and constantly seeking new ways to improve.
It is.
It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn and grow.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most powerful takeaways from the lean startup. It's not just a set of tactics or techniques. It's a mindset shift. It can really transform the way you approach challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, it's almost like a philosophy for navigating uncertainty and complexity. And it feels incredibly relevant right now, given how quickly the world is changing.
Absolutely. In a world where disruption is the norm, the ability to adapt and evolve is more valuable than ever. And the lean startup provides a framework for doing just that.
So for our listeners out there, What advice would you give to someone who's thinking, okay, this is all great stuff, but how do I actually apply this to my work? Where should they start?
I would say start with a small experiment. Pick one area of your work where you can apply one of these principles,
Yeah.
whether it's breaking down a task into smaller batches or using the 5 whys to get to the root cause of a problem. Just start somewhere.
So take that first step,
Yes.
even if it feels small or insignificant.
It might feel small.
But those small changes can lead to big results over time.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to fail. Failure is just feedback. It's an opportunity to learn and improve. The key is to fail fast, learn from those failures, and iterate quickly.
And remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are tons of resources available to help you apply these principles. The Lean Startup is a great place to start, but there are also online communities, workshops, and mentors who can provide guidance and support along the way.
You're right. It's a journey, not a destination. And the more you embrace that journey, the more successful you'll be.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much. Before we wrap things up, is there one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I would say this. Don't be afraid to challenge your assumptions, get out of the building, talk to your customers, and be willing to pivot when needed. Embrace the uncertainty, stay curious, and never stop learning.
That's great advice. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the Lean Startup. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found these insights as valuable as we did, and we encourage you to continue exploring these concepts on your own. Until next time, keep learning, keep experimenting, and keep building awesome things.